So, as we've done at the beginning of each week during this series, we have recited the entire psalm together. So, if you would stand, we're going to recite this together. And at the beginning of the series, we've asked you to consider memorizing this psalm, this really beloved, famous psalm, 6 verses over 7 weeks, which shouldn't be too hard. And there's a lot of benefits in really memorizing God's word. And so, if you have memorized any or all of Psalm 23, as we recite this, I'm going to ask you to recite it with your eyes closed, okay? So if you've memorized it. If you haven't, then you could look. So let's recite this together. Ready? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Here ends a reading of God's word. You may be seated. So we're going to focus on the phrase, he restores my soul, and then the second half of this verse that says, he leads me in paths of righteousness. When we often think of Psalm 23, this is usually the scene that comes to our mind. Sheep at peace, pleasant, grazing on some really nourishing pasture. Well, in the Middle East, in the context of Psalm 23, when David wrote the psalm, this is actually not the scene that he would have experienced. In the context of Psalm 23, he restores my soul. In the Middle East, really, it looks more like this. There are only 3 months out of the entire year when the wilderness desert is filled with greenery, but most of the year, it's more wilderness and desert than it is green pastures. And so when he says he restores my soul, that's because sheep are living and grazing in the midst of these harsh, challenging environments. So if you think about it, your lives and mine, our lives are surrounded by similar environment. There's challenges, there's troubles, there's trials, setbacks. We have to remember that David, he experienced discouragement, isolation, setbacks, and we have too. And some of those things have led him to a sense of despair, a sense of burnout, and even hopelessness. If you read through the Psalms, they're just an honest diary of a man's journey with God. And so he will even say, for example, why are you downcast, O my soul? And so when he says that God restores his soul, it's really in the midst of living life, the challenges of everyday living. There's a parallel here when David says he restores my soul. There's an old English shepherd term. Now, I'm not much of a sheep expert. So 2 weeks ago, when I was preaching on the one part of the Psalm 23, I made the comment that no team mascot is named after like sheep. Remember that? I was like, well, you know, you have the Seattle Seahawks, you have the Chicago Bulls, right? Who would name them like the Detroit Lambs, right? Because lambs in general, they're dumb, they're dirty, and they're defenseless. Little did I know that one of the teams that I mentioned, I don't know if you caught this if you were here, was the Los Angeles Rams. After service, some of you are like, yeah, so. Some of you, after service, somebody came up to me and he sung, hey, I have one issue with your sermon. I'm like, what is that? So a ram is actually a male sheep. I was like, what? No way, right? I was today years old when I found out that a ram was a male sheep. So I'm no sheep expert at all here. But there's a great book by Philip Keller named A Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23. And he's a real shepherd, and he really does a masterful job of walking through this psalm. And one of the things that he points out is that there's this old English shepherding term called when what happens is when a sheep is cast down, right? And You know what that is? That is when a sheep rolls over to its side in order to rest, and instead it finds itself like flipped upside down. As they roll over, their center of gravity suddenly shifts, and they find themselves like this, right? The thing about sheep is they can't get right side up by themselves, which is why shepherds every single day count their sheep, right? Some of you count sheep in order to fall asleep. Shepherds count their sheep because if some of them are missing, their first thought is, oh, my sheep has wandered and they're probably cast down somewhere. What happens is they get cast down, their legs are up in the air, they start frantically moving about, and then they start losing blood circulation in the extremities. Well, anywhere from a few hours to a couple days, they're in that position, and really it leads to death. And unless a shepherd keeps a sharp eye on their sheep, predators also have sharp eyes on the sheep. So you have coyotes and wolves and vultures who find really easy prey when sheep are cast down. What happens is they get into a panic mode, and then they start flailing about. They move, and that doesn't help either because it cuts off more circulation, leading to a quicker death. When a shepherd finds a sheep that is cast down, they will come and gently roll the sheep over on its leg. And because they've already lost blood circulation, right? You ever have, like, when your legs fall asleep and you can't move, right? The shepherd will kind of rub its legs to get the blood flowing again until the sheep can walk off again. This is a really great parallel when it comes to this phrase that he restores my soul. Because oftentimes we find ourselves in panic mode, not being able to get out of a situation that we may have put ourselves in. And Jesus, as the good shepherd, he doesn't condemn us. He doesn't say, oh, you backslider, why'd you wander away? He comes and gently assists us and pulls us right side up so that we could walk with him again. He does that with a gentleness and a quietness and a reassuring sense of his presence. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about rest and restoration. The other phrase that he talks about in this verse is not only he restores my soul, but he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Sheep, if they are left to themselves, will graze on the same patch of grass like all day long. Even when there's no more grass left over and it's down to its root or even to the dirt, they will continue to eat the root where there's no nourishment, and sheep will literally eat themselves to death because they're eating, but it's not really filling their stomach at all. In fact, some of them can actually be poisonous. And so what the shepherd has to do is he needs to take the sheep and lead them to paths of where the paths will lead to green pastures and water, because again, sheep are dumb, they'll just eat themselves to death. And so the phrase, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And so we're going to talk about paths of righteousness, paths of health and wholeness that will lead to restoration of our souls. Now today, we're doing things a little bit differently. You see a couch and a couple chairs. It's not because I'm going to be preaching from you laying down, but I'm going to invite John, our location pastor, and Christine, our Grace Student Ministry pastor, to come up, and we're going to have like a panel sermon where they're going to share some insight. Hopefully, you're going to get insights and encouragements into practices and paths that God has provided, especially in the midst of our exhaustion and tiredness. So would you give them a hand as we welcome them up on stage? So, Memorial Day weekend is the unofficial beginning of summer. And when you think of summer, we often think of vacation, trips, rest, laying in the hammock, whatever it is. The irony about summer, though, is we go on vacation, and you ever have this, you get back from vacation and you need a vacation from vacation, right? And then all the things that you want to do this summer to rest and relax and rejuvenate, you find yourself almost like a sheep that's cast down. Your legs are just going and going, frantic activity. You just fill your calendar so much that what was supposed to be a season of rest and refreshment actually becomes a season where you're just, August 31st comes and you're like, where did the summer go, right? Like, I don't feel rested at all. I feel like it just flew by. And so we want to be really intentional about talking about what does rest look like, and what do paths of restoration look like for us, especially as we enter into the summer season?
Yeah, I know for me, my default setting can be if it's good, then I should do it. Like, if there is an event that's going to be exciting, like, I should say yes. And I just start saying yes to everything. Like, it's easy to say yes to every friend that has an ask, or every hobby that seems fun and exciting, or every opportunity that feels like, oh, this is going to be good for me. And I just keep saying yes until, yeah, I feel like I'm a frantic ball of energy. And I really experienced that coming out of COVID, like that first summer after everything started to open back up. I had like my old commitments that I had made, I'd filled my life during COVID, and then I wanted to add all of these new things that I could suddenly say yes to. And I just kept saying yes until I became totally disconnected from myself. Like, I felt like I was disconnected from my own soul. And I didn't even recognize it as burnout because it was full of good things. It was things that I loved to do, things that brought me joy, but I couldn't find joy in them anymore. And I didn't even recognize what this was until I read this quote in Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, a devotional I was going through at the time, that said, burnout isn't giving too much. Burnout is giving that which you do not possess. It is the ultimate in giving too little. And I realized, like, yeah, by saying yes to everything, I was trying to give what I didn't have to offer my time, myself, my energy,
Yeah.
and I was giving too little.
I think that's a really great insight about burnout. We often think of burnout as like, oh, I'm working too much, I'm doing too much. It's not that you're doing too much as like you're not taking in and you're giving away something you don't have.
Yeah.
Right? So whether you're a parent or you're a student or an employee, whatever it is, right? The resource that Christine is talking about, I'm going to put it up on the screen here, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality Day by Peter Scazzero. It's not your typical devotion where you just read it. It really helps you enter into a time of silence and stillness before God. And then it has a passage of scripture and a very short devotional. And you conclude, again, with a period of silence and stillness before God. And it's a daily thing that you could do. It's a great resource. You could buy it on Amazon, or I know John has extra copies if you're really interested in engaging in that kind of way. But that's just understand that, right? Burnout isn't because you're working too much or doing too much. It's you're not receiving. John, how has that worked out for you?
Yeah, as I think about my life as a pastor over decades, there was a very common pattern. I'd work really hard to try and get to the point where I could go on vacation for a couple of weeks. And so I would start vacation and I would be totally exhausted. Sometimes, in order to maximize the time, we'd drive through the night in order to get to our destination sooner. And then during vacation, we had so much we wanted to do. We would pack our schedules full and just go from one adventure to the next adventure. And then I would get home after being a couple weeks away, and there'd be a pile of work waiting for me. And so I would be exhausting leaving, even more exhausted after a week of vacation. I'd come back to extra responsibilities. And on the worst, in my younger years, I would allow even ministry to sabotage our vacation time. And I have pictures of myself in my mind in a parking lot, just pacing back and forth, having these conflicted conversations while I'm supposed to be at the lake with my family. Instead, I'm working out conflict with someone from the church. So. And then additionally, as a young pastor wanting to be successful, I took a role of doing a restart of a church, a core of a church that was dying, and I was given 3 years for that church to be restarted. If it wasn't successfully self-supporting in 3 years, they'd close it down. And so just the pressure of I've got 3 years to either be successful as a pastor or a failure as a pastor. And I carried the weight of that work day and night and day and night, until I found myself in that place of being cast down.
It seemed like you work a lot, John. I thought pastors work only like 30 minutes every Sunday, right? Yeah. No? I don't make you work that hard, do I?
That's debatable.
So, John, I mean, I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? Deadlines and stress and demands from work and family and vacation, all that kind of stuff. When you look beyond just the symptoms and the outer activity, What do you think was happening underneath?
Yeah, so for those of you that are familiar with the Enneagram, I am a 3, which is the achiever. And so I had this really strong drive to achieve, and my identity was wrapped up in being successful and having other people affirm my leadership as a pastor. And so I got caught up in people pleasing as well, that really played a toll on me, trying to please people while also trying to please God. And in fact, a pastor, mentor, friend of mine gave me a picture frame that said, "Live to please an audience of one." And honestly, if I'm going to lead for Jesus, I'm certainly not going to please everybody, because that's just not the call. And then my people pleasing tendencies also led me to not have good boundaries, and I had to just figure out how to establish healthier boundaries in my life.
Wow, John, you're pretty messed up.
I am, absolutely.
Not like any of us, right? we can't relate to any of that. Christine, when you think about where you found yourself post-COVID and being just stressed and burnt out, what were some of the underlying conditions?
Yeah, I think in some ways it's like almost there was nothing underneath that, in that I wasn't giving it any real thought or intentionality. My default setting was just, if it's good, say yes, without any thought of what is God calling me to, what unique gifts has God given me, or what are my boundaries that I need to have. I wasn't really taking that quiet time with God to discern, who He was and what He was asking of me. I was just kind of on autopilot, and my autopilot was yes.
Yeah. And again, if you're familiar with the Enneagram, Christine is a 2, which is called the helper. And so her natural tendency is to help, which is great. On the flip side, right? Like, oh, it's so hard to say no. And that's where you found yourself. And I think one lesson that I can draw from this is just like not only knowledge of God, but knowledge of yourself, your strengths, but your own limits, really helping you to create those boundaries either way, of either overworking or really figuring out what is it that is really driving you as a pastor or as a student or as a parent, right? Is it your need to be lauded as a great parent, or to be successful at? There's something that's driving all of that, which has been leading to kind of the sense of exhaustion and burnout for a lot of us.
And if we don't take time to actually, look at what's going on inside us, it's easy for I think all of us to go on autopilot.
Yeah. So we talk about God restoring our souls. Let's talk about what does it look like to walk in the paths of righteousness, as the psalmist says, for His name's sake, right? And in this case, I want to frame it as paths of righteousness are paths that God has created for us, so that we could find that kind of restoration and the rest that we deeply, deeply need. One resource that I want to point out is a book, I think it's called The 7 Types of Rest by Sandra Dalton Smith. Sandra Dalton Smith. And she has here's a visual here that she's created of, here's one note, like it's not just physical rest, but there's emotional, spiritual, mental, social, sensory, and creative rest, right? Oftentimes when we think of, oh, I'm tired, we often think I'm physically tired. Well, she actually has a free online quiz. I'm going to put the website right up there on the bottom, restquiz.com. After the service, I'd encourage you to take it. When I took that test, I was feeling pretty exhausted, pretty drained. I thought, I'm physically tired. I'm not getting enough sleep. Mentally, I just felt like, I'm thinking all day, strategizing, preparing sermons. I took that, and it really surprised me because emotional exhaustion came out very, very high, right? And she has a way of saying, if you're between this range and this range, you're good. If you're here, you got to be careful. And if you're up at this range, hey, you got to take some action now. Emotional rest was very low for me, right? And not only that, but it was also creative rest. I would have never had the words to even articulate what kind of rest I needed. Here's the thing that happens is we come from a long day of work and we just think, man, I'm so tired. Well, to specify, like, oh, am I emotionally tired? Or am I mentally tired? Or am I socially tired? This really gave me a framework to understand, like, what kind of rest is it that I need to restore myself? Because, as we'll talk about more, like, emotional, the path to rest and restoration emotionally isn't the same as, let's say, social rest or mental rest. So it's very different pathways to lead to that kind of rest.
Yeah, and this has been a super helpful test. I know for me, and we have a podcast at Grace called Rhythms of Grace that you can find on Spotify or wherever. And we actually took a whole season. Sung and myself and our previous executive pastor Nate Kimball spent a whole season of the podcast talking about sensory, creative, physical rest, all 7 types of rest. And so I want to invite you guys to yeah, take a listen, take the test, and really lean into those different types of rest.
Yeah, and when you took this test, you were surprised by what you found as well, too.
Yeah, yeah, I had never heard of sensory rest as a type of rest, and that was like, yeah, emotional rest and sensory rest. Where, yeah, I was so exhausted in those areas, and I didn't even know what that meant. And so, yeah, I remember after I took the test, I saw that, and I went home and I just like laid on the ground with like a blanket over my entire body. I just like laid there for like 30 minutes because I just needed sensory rest. And it's so counter to how I normally would have rested, which was like turning on a screen and listening to a podcast, which was actually making me more exhausted.
Yeah, that's a really great insight, right? Because again, we often think, oh, I'm tired, I'll watch Netflix, when in fact your sensory was really overloaded and exhausted. And if you did that, you would have actually created the opposite effect of getting real rest, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So when it comes to paths of righteousness, what are some actions or rhythms that you have established in order to get the kind of rest that you need?
Yeah, so I mentioned sensory was at the top, and one of the things that, one of the rhythms that I've established to kind of maintain, yeah, a lifetime of health is setting technology limits. Like my phone has parental controls on it, because otherwise I won't like turn off Netflix, or I'll get caught in that cycle of like, yeah, looking at my screen for too long, and it actually drains me. And I turn off my email at 8 p.m. every single day because I can't, as a two, I can't just make myself available to the world all hours of the day, or I'll just get caught.